Next, we'd like to introduce our featured presenter, our Lark Doolan. I saw you come on the call here when I finally made it. Charlie would like to introduce you formally to our club, and thank you for being here and offering a presentation for us.
Yeah, awesome. I'm really excited, as always, to introduce Lark Doolan. Since I've met him, he's always been a huge advocate for social justice and restorative practices and all these amazing things that he brings to his students as far as like therapeutic things. He has a meditation labyrinth, and he has I've just known him as a very strong person in our community and advocate for people. Today, him and Niko Campan both volunteer with Queer Humboldt. Lark is the executive director, and together with their team of staff of volunteers, they create a safe, inclusive place for marginalized people in Humboldt County and also surrounding areas. So club, please welcome Lark Doolan and Niko.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me back. It's great to be here again. I'm Lark Doolan, Executive Director, Queer Humboldt. I use he, him pronouns. Niko, you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Niko Campan. I use they, them pronouns. I'm a volunteer at Queer Humboldt, and yeah.
So one thing I always like to do is to give an itinerary for our experience. So Niko, go for it.
So yes, we're going to go over some vocabulary and key concepts, and then we're going to give you some practical tips on how to use those key concepts in real life. And then we're going to tell you what's up at Queer Humboldt. And if we have time, we'll do a Q&A at the end. So before we start, Queer Humboldt affirms our gratitude to the Wiyot, Yurok, Hupa, Karuk, and neighboring tribes for their leadership, stewardship, and many cultural contributions, both historical and present day. We affirm Native sovereignty and pledge to actively dismantle settler colonialism through our work in the community. Queer people exist in all communities, thus queer liberation is inextricably intertwined with the Black Lives Matter movement. Just immigration policies and practices, Native sovereignty, disability rights, feminism, and all movements that dismantle systems of oppression.
I think this is a really important concept, because whatever social justice work a person is doing, there's a queer aspect to it. And for whatever queer work we're doing, there's an anti-racist aspect and an anti-ableist aspect and all of these things. I'm gonna pop into the chat.
Oh, sorry.
I popped into a chat, just our website, in case you want to check out our website and get a feel for us that way. And I'm also just popping into the chat a video that covers the concept of two-spirit. So if you have 20 minutes today, or 6 minutes today, it's a 6-minute video, and you want to learn a little about the two-spirit movement, where it came from, what it's about, I'm just popping that resource in the chat in case you want to save that for later.
So key concepts. One of them is basically sexual orientation does not equal gender identity. I can tell you my gender identity and you wouldn't necessarily know my sexual orientation and vice versa.
Yeah, I think this one is like a really common concept that gets conflated because the LGBTQ umbrella conflates all these, right? So like a gay person might know very little about trans people, and a trans person might know very little about gay culture, and yet we're all kind of one queer community. And so sometimes people think we're talking about sexual orientation when we're actually talking about gender identity, or vice versa. So just to tease these out a little, sexual orientation is about who you love, who you're attracted to, who you want to build your family with. And gender identity is about how you relate to gender in our culture, how you feel about your gender and how you express your gender. It has nothing to do with your romance life or who you're attracted to. So these are separate concepts. And then similarly, in terms of things that get really conflated, physical bodies get conflated with gender, and it's a sex and gender, or biological sex and gender. And these are actually really different concepts. Biological sex is about your anatomy. It's about what you're born with. It's about your chromosomes. It's those things. Gender is about all the cultural expectations that we put on those. So around the world and throughout history, gender is different in different places, right? So there are places in the world where like men wearing skirts is very, very normal, like Scotland and India. There are times in history where men wearing heels is very masculine, right? George Washington wore heels. That was something that men did in that time. So these are cultural norms. And so when we're talking about gender, we're talking about culture. It's a very separate conversation than biology. And people try to make these the same, and they're not, and they never really have been. And so one thing that's helpful is to just be very specific in our language, because a person's anatomy doesn't tell you about their gender, and a person's gender doesn't tell you about their anatomy. Niko, anything you want to add to that one?
Yes. So for me, like a good way like to remember this is that gender is between your ears. So and biological sex is basically in your chromosomes. Just to break it down to the essentials. For me, like for example, I am part Japanese, and it is very, very customary. Like there's a specific kind of kimono that you wear if you are a male and versus you are a female. And I have never ever been comfortable in like being like constricted and having like the like it's just not a fun time for me. So my mom would always give me like honoring my gender identity, always give me a kimono for a man. And my mom's like 66. So
one thing that I think is really helpful to remember is that right now we happen to be living in a culture that is really discriminatory towards trans people. But throughout the world and throughout history, that hasn't always been the case. In pretty much every continent except for the Antarctic, queer people have existed, and trans people specifically have existed, often holding sacred roles within society and special cultural roles. Right now, we happen to be living in a society where we're marginalized and discriminated against, but that's not the truth of who we are, and that's not the truth of who we can be in this world. And so part of the work that we do at Queer Humboldt is education-based, so that we can learn about the natural diversity that exists within gender, and that's always existed within gender, that's just been actively erased in our current society. We do find it's really important to just like pause a little and talk about vocabulary, because sometimes when I start talking about queer topics, I say LGBTQ, and 20 minutes into the conversation, the other person says, "What do the letters mean?" And I'm like, oh my gosh, I've been talking for 20 minutes and we're not actually communicating. Or I do a whole presentation at the end. Their question is, what's cisgender mean? And I realize I've said cisgender 20 times, and they weren't able to follow all of these contents because we don't all show up to this meeting this morning with the same education about queerness and the same vocabulary around queerness. And even within the queer community, language is always evolving and changing. And part of that is by design, right? The English language is not designed to talk about us and our experiences. We've been actively erased from language for so many decades that it's clunky and hard to talk about. LGBTQ2+, right? It's not an acronym that just like rolls off the tongue and is easy to talk about like potatoes. And that's part of being a marginalized person. And it's something that other movements also experience. And so we like to take a moment to define a couple of these terms just so that we're on the same page about how we're using language today. And also because the definitions of these might have changed since you learned them. So for example, when I learned lesbian as a word, it meant women who love women. Whereas now more and more people are using it to mean non-men who love non-men, which is a non-binary inclusive way of using the word lesbian. So that's like a shift in language. Not all lesbians have the same definition. So when someone says, oh, we've got a lesbian potluck, I'm always like, so how do you define that? Because I don't want to send a trans woman into a space that's unsafe or unwelcoming, or a non-binary person into a space that isn't going to welcome them. And so taking the time to kind of pause and like be like, what do you mean when you use that word can be really helpful to make sure we have clarity in communication. Niko, you want to take one? You're muted.
Yes, I would love to take one. So I identify as non-binary, and that means that we have like in our society we have a gender binary, and there are certain aspects of that gender binary that you're in. If you're a man, there are certain aspects that you have to, like certain performative things that you have to do for your gender identity. I exist outside of that. So I have never really, I didn't really connect with my assigned assigned gender at birth. And I was always like told like I was a tomboy and stuff like that. So for me, non-binary can mean a lot of different things for everybody. It's just like the term lesbian. You can talk to many different non-binary people and they will give you a different definition of non-binary, but really it just means someone who exists outside of that gender binary. So they could be agender, like they don't identify with a gender. They can be bigender, they identify with more than one gender. They can be gender fluid, their gender identity shifts from day to day. Or they can just identify as non-binary and not elaborate further.
Awesome. Thank you, Niko. I'll define transgender. The way I define transgender is anyone who radically transgresses gender norms. Anyone who radically transgresses gender norms. So for example, I was born, the doctor said, it's a girl. And that is not who I am. Like I am a guy so clearly and within myself. And people who really get to know me, even when I was presenting like a woman and I hadn't yet transitioned, people would be hanging out with me and they'd be like, oh, you're a queer guy. I get you now, right? They would have this aha moment where they saw me for who I am. And eventually I decided to transition and live full-time as a guy. And so that's a pretty radical transgression of gender norms in our society, transitioning from one gender to another. And the word transgender is a huge umbrella term and it includes a lot of different people. Cisgender, on the other hand, is people who are born and the doctor's like, or the midwife or the lucky taxi driver is like, it's a girl. And if you grow up and you feel like a girl and you dress like a girl, that's called cisgender. Or if you're born and they say it's a boy and you grow up and you feel like a boy and you express yourself like a guy, that's called cisgender. So if what you were assigned at birth matches who you feel on the inside and how you live, that's called cisgender. And if you radically transgress those gender norms, transgender is a word for that. And then queer is just a huge umbrella term that so many people use to describe anyone who's not heterosexual and or cisgender. Not all queer people use these words to describe themselves. Often education is a major factor. So it's more likely that educated people will call themselves members of the LGBTQ2+ community. Because access to language and access to education and the tools for understanding these concepts is not something that we all have equal access to. And so there are tons of queer people that don't identify as queer. They don't use a word for it. They just are who they are and prefer not to use labels, right? Or who attended an LGBTQ event and experienced ableism or racism or some other type of ism or obia, and then are like, well, that's not my community. You know, I just happen to like other women or whatever it is. And so, you know, the thing about this language is it's so imperfect, but we're doing our best to describe something, which is that we are people who exist outside of what our society tells us is allowed because of who we love or how we feel and how we interact with gender. So this natural aspect of human diversity has been annexed in our society to be othered. And I think some people don't realize just how much that can impact us every day. Certainly in the pandemic, I've had the privilege of being home a lot. And so I'm not experiencing transphobia every day in the way that I was before the pandemic. And it's given me the opportunity to look at how normalized that experience of discrimination had become for me. I think there are a lot of gender expansive youth that have realized who they are through their friends online over the last year and a half, who are now returning to schools. And we're seeing a huge increase in youth identifying as being non-binary. And one of the things Queer Humboldt does is support schools in trainings and mental health support for youth. I always like to include this definition of bisexuality because I think bisexuality is hugely misunderstood. And this is a quote by Robin Oakes, who's a bisexual advocate and author. She says, bisexuals are people who acknowledge in themselves the potential to be attracted romantically and or sexually to people of more than one sex and or gender, not necessarily at the same time, not necessarily in the same way, and not necessarily to the same degree. And I love this definition because I grew up being told bisexuals are people who are attracted to men and women. Well, first of all, that's binary. There's more than two genders. Last time I counted, I got to at least 13 and then I gave up because there's so many different ways to express gender within our society and to feel one's gender. So I appreciate that this is a non-binary inclusive definition for bisexuality, but I also appreciate it's not about your behavior and what you've done. There's plenty of people that get married young and are in heterosexual marriages and recognize within themselves that they can feel attracted to more than one gender. And even if they never act on that, recognizing that potential within oneself, that's bisexuality. And so there's a lot of people around us who are bisexual who don't necessarily know that. Hey, congratulations. If you're someone who just realized I might be bisexual, congratulations. Sometimes we get that feedback after our trainings. I've had a lot of people come up to me after our trainings and say, I never knew there was a word for someone like me. I've had many senior citizens come up to me and say, they never taught me. I've been trying to describe this thing my whole life. I'm non-binary. I finally have a word for it, right? So I just want to celebrate this moment for anyone who's having that experience, because it actually happens after about half of our trainings that someone follows up in that way. All right. LGBTTIQQAAP. There are so many letters. There's so many letters and they just keep coming. There's so many words. And what I want to emphasize to you is that it's not about knowing all the letters and it's not about knowing all the words, because it's always changing. I learned a new one like a week ago. It's about showing people your support. It's about believing people when they tell you who they are, and not challenging someone, questioning someone, or asking them to prove something that they're sharing with you from a place of generosity and vulnerability. And so you don't have to know all the words and all the language all the time. I mess up sometimes too. But you can still show your support by honoring and respecting people's identities, by using the names that they use for themselves and the pronouns that they use for themselves. These are two of the most important things you can do to reduce the risk of suicide for gender expansive youth. And they're two of the most important things you can do to create a welcoming space for queer people in your environment. And so with pronouns, I just want to take a moment and talk about pronouns, because every time I present, I get questions about pronouns. I recently presented, I got 8 questions, and they were 8 questions about pronouns. And I think that this is kind of where the rubber meets the road, because a lot of queerness you can just kind of ignore or be like, okay, whatever, I'm cool with that, but you don't have to interact with it necessarily. Whereas with pronouns, when someone says for example, I use he, him pronouns, people who knew me before I transitioned had to change what pronouns they were using for me. And that's something that they have to do, right? A lot of queerness you can just kind of ignore, and you can accept it or not accept it. It doesn't really matter. You don't have to do anything in regards to it. But with pronouns, you're being asked to change something that you're doing. And specifically, you're being asked to change what words you use to describe someone, because who they are is not who you thought they were, or who, when you look at them, you assume they must be. And that's where work comes in. And so I just really want to encourage you to take the time to get people's pronouns right. And I practice in front of the mirror if I mess up. So if I mess up twice on someone's pronouns, I go to them privately and I say, I want you to know I'm going to practice in the mirror for 2 minutes every time I mess up, because I know how important this is and I'm committed to getting it right. And lo and behold, practice really, really, really helps retrain the brain. So I just really want to encourage that, because it makes a huge difference. Being mispronounced can ruin someone's day. Can ruin someone's day. It depends on the person, and they may or may not tell you if it ruined their day. So those are just a couple thoughts. I do want to, I know we're getting near the end of time. I just want to talk a little about Queer Humboldt, because we've been around since 2004. And the former leadership retired a year ago, which is when I came on as executive director with my new board. We are intentionally anti-racist as an organization. The majority of our board are people of color. We prioritize centering people who have multiple marginalized identities. For example, people who are queer and disabled, or people who are people of color and queer, because we realize that that there are lots and lots of people of color in the queer community who have not been celebrated and welcomed in queer spaces. And we're committed to doing that. And we ask that other people who are doing other social justice work take a moment to ponder how queerness is impacting your community and how you can make sure that you're being intersectionally aware of queer people within other populations as well, because we're part of all of the populations. We have a whole bunch of services that we've launched in the last year. Some of these came from the pandemic and realizing our community was in urgent need of help. And others were ones that we've been doing for a long time. So for example, we have a micro grant program, which provides mutual aid and micro grants. So for example, Two-Spirit mother raising a Two-Spirit child wanted gender inclusive children's books for her child. And so we helped her get picture books in her house that showed families like hers. Another example would be a member of our community who wanted to be a mental health clinician and needed a fee, $130 to pay the fee in order to take a test, in order to be of service in the substance abuse community, helping our community. So those are some examples. We also have a mental health counseling center. So we provide sliding scale therapy with mental health clinicians for children who are queer, for adults who are queer, and for the parents of gender expansive youth. So for example, if a kid comes out as transgender and the parent is struggling with that, we want to help that parent get on board, because while we can help the kid directly, nothing is going to be as impactful as that parent loving their child and knowing how to support them. And so we work with straight and cisgender parents in that way as well. We do community education like this presentation today. We do advocacy, for example, a transgender inmate in our local jail. We're helping her out with some legal things and a pen pal. We do community building events, and we connect people to resources. For example, people moving to the area that need help finding a gay friendly realtor because they're nervous about being a gay couple coming to a rural area. And we also provide internships. So we have a social work intern from HSU. So I know we're at time. This is when we usually do our Q&A, but Ian, I'll throw the baton back to you, and just thank you so much for having us out. We love serving our community, and it's a privilege to come and meet you today. My name is Lark Doolan. My email is larkdoolan@gmail. And I'm really happy to connect and support you in the work that you're doing. We are launching a fundraiser later today for our micro grant program. We've provided almost $11,000 in $50 to $200 increments for queer community members in need. And we're ready to do a second round of that program. And so we're starting that fundraiser today. All right, thanks everyone. And thank you, Niko.
Thank you everyone for having us.
Lark and Niko, thank you so much for being out with us today. And this is such an important realization in our community. You're among friends here. I know that there was a fundraiser that I did for my birthday, and many of our members here contributed to that for Queer Humboldt. One of the things that you touched on earlier had to do with how queerness in general has been erased from our language. Our language has been colonial and set up in a binary manner. And I know that as my own children have revealed who they are to themselves and to our family, language has been a real struggling point for my elder parents, and to help them understand how to function in a language that really did not include, by design, queerness. So thank you for touching on that. That's so important to realize. So as all of us work within our language and hear these new terms, I'd say new to us because we've been just neglected to have them included, please understand that this is rebuilding lost language. Who has other questions for Lark and Niko?
I put a question in the chat, or just in terms of Queer Humboldt and your involvement with older adults who are in the population, because we see a lot of ageism associated with, well, there's a lot of ageism in our society, and just how that double impacts older adults, especially around healthcare issues, around who are they sharing information with, whether people have rights to share that information, and how the medical community looks at them. And also what happens if they feel like they have to go into a facility setting where they going back in the closet's a real big deal. I mean, do you have members and older adults who you're supporting in these issues?
Yes, absolutely. And I was just putting in the chat when you started talking to respond to that, because it's so important. Respecting our elders is something the queer community has not always done a great job at. And so it is one of the many ways that we're centering double marginalized people or multi-marginalized people. So we share resources for older LGBTQ adults on our Facebook group. And we also are support. I just thought of one and it slipped my mind. But yes, we're working with a group that's starting a local nursing home that is explicitly building queer inclusion into their practice, because that is such a huge problem in terms of discrimination in the later years. So yeah, this is definitely something we're aware of and being proactive about.
And I'll email you offline to talk about more resources. So
awesome, thank you. Yeah, we have resources on our website and we love more, so we invite them.
Okay, thanks.
How does one participate in your fundraiser?
Yeah, so we're going to be posting it on Facebook later today. We discovered the beauty of Facebook fundraisers thanks to Ian. We'd never done one. And I was like, whoa, this is cool. So we're going to give that a try today. And so keep an eye on Facebook. We've got a Facebook page, Queer Humboldt, and we'll be posting it there probably this afternoon.
They make it so easy. That's why I was in contact so much, Lark. It made me nervous to know, is this a real thing? Does the funds actually come through? So thanks for playing along there. We appreciate it. Okay, real quick to wrap up the meeting. Again, thank you so much, Lark and Niko, for being here. We genuinely appreciate the education, and I know it's not on your shoulders to do that educating, but it's a great touch and starting point for everybody here to look further and understand. So thank you. Real quick, just briefly, remember we've got another week to submit your costume pictures. This can be from any part of your life. This is just for fun. I've received some, and looking back at our old fundraising events, especially the spring fundraisers, I know our club likes to dress up. So please send in your favorites, and there will be prizes on Freakish Final Friday. Lark and Niko, in recognition of your presenting here today, we have two things. We make a donation to the Wheelchair Foundation in your name, which provides wheelchairs to people that could not otherwise afford them. So thank you for presenting and giving us that opportunity to give in your name. And then at the end of each meeting, I provide my form of expression is haiku, and for better or worse, I've written this one for you two and the queer community. So thank you for inspiring me. Inclusivity, LGBTQ2+, love for everyone. Thank you everyone today. Again, if you'd like to stay on, please do to get signed up. I'll help you get that process done. We do need volunteers to make our Oktoberfest successful. So stay on the call if you can. I'll get you signed up right away. Thank you, everybody.